to start our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Randy Melzi, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy Programs and Corporate Relations here at the Americas Society Council of the Americas. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this public breakfast and discussion with Augusto Lopez, Director of Global Indicators and Analysis at the World Bank and at the International Finance Corporation. Augusto is here today to discuss how to promote prosperity through improving women's rights. He will present the joint publication and project by the World Bank and the IFC entitled Women, Business, and the Law, a report that provides quantitative data measuring such legal differentiations and gender parity in 141 economies. After his presentation, Augusto will open up the floor for questions from the audience. You can find Augusto's biography on our program. We're delighted to have you all with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Augusto. Thanks again for joining us and for promoting this here today.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I wanted to divide my remarks perhaps in 2 or 3 parts. I'd like to say a few words about the genesis for the Women, Business, and the Law project, how that all got started. I would like to tell you a little bit about the methodology that we use to collect this very valuable data set, and in particular, what does the data say? Our last report was published in late 2011, and the team working on this project is actually working on the next edition, which we hope to launch sometime in September of this year. And I'd just like to give you a sense of what are some of the insights that are coming out of this massive amount of data. And then I'd just like to make some more general remarks about gender and the connections of gender with economic development. As I was telling Randy just a few minutes ago, in the bank we do something called the Doing Business Project. In fact, the Doing Business report has become, I don't want to quite say a bestseller, but it is really the most prominent publication that the World Bank puts out at the moment. It even exceeds in scope and in popularity, if you wish, the World Development Report, which is something that the World Bank has been doing for more than 30 years. In the Doing Business report, what we have done is we have built a large number of indicators that track different dimensions of the business environment. If you want to know, how difficult it is to get to a firm registered in a country, if you want to know how difficult it is to, or how easy, as the case may be, to register property, to gain access to credit, to pay your taxes, to engage in international trade across borders, if you want to know what do countries' laws say about the protection of minority investors, shareholders, and so on, we have them. We have those indicators, and what we do is we rank countries on an annual basis, and we can tell you something about the quality of the business environment in 185 countries. A few years ago, some people, stakeholders, executive directors representing various constituencies at the World Bank began to ask us, why is it that in your Doing Business project you don't have a gender dimension? The way that you have defined the indicators seem to be gender neutral. And so we began to think a little bit about this, and we began to collect some data. In particular, we began to look at the various ways in which countries use laws and regulations to basically hold back women, violate her rights, make it difficult for her to work, make it difficult for her to engage in a number of different activities that have an impact for her ability to participate actively in the economy. And so we began to essentially build an online law library, which in the end became the biggest and the most substantial law library in the world. We collected every constitution, every civil code, every draft or version of family law. In fact, any conceivable piece of, or any legal instrument that had a bearing on the issue of gender for a large number of countries, 141 countries. And in the end, we decided that we were actually, rather than embedding something into the existing doing business project, we were going to do a project, as a self-standing project, on its own, which is basically women, business, and the law. Now, this project got started by asking a series of very probing questions about, various ways in which countries use the law to discriminate against women. And I want to give you just a sense of the data that we collect by sharing with you very briefly. It'll take me a minute and a half or two. What are some of the questions that we raise, that we ask, for which we look for answers in the law? For instance, can a woman, whether married or single, apply for a passport in the same way as a man? Can she travel outside the country in the same way as a man? Can she sign a contract? Can she register a business? Can she be considered head of household? Does she have the right to confer citizenship on her children? Can she open a bank account? Are married women required by law to obey their husbands? It turns out that in many countries they are. Is there a non-discrimination clause covering gender in the Constitution? You would think that by now this would be universal all over the world. In fact, it isn't. There isn't a clause. Chile is a country that, by far and away the best managed economy in Latin America, doesn't have a non-discrimination clause in the Constitution. Who legally administers marital property? In the case of dissolution of the marriage, who's entitled to the ownership of the marital home? Do men and women, whether married or single, have equal ownership rights to property? Do sons and daughters have equal inheritance rights to property? Can women work in the same industries as men? In many countries, they can't. The law is very paternalistic, and it seeks to protect women, from gaining access to other areas where men have been working for a long, long time. Is she protected, for instance, by the law from taking her position back after she has gone on maternity leave? Are there laws or constitutional provisions mandating equal pay between men and women for equal work? Are there specific tax deductions that apply only to men and not to women? Does her testimony in court carry the same evidentiary weight as it does for a man? Do adult married women need permission from their husbands in order to initiate legal proceedings in court? And so on. I could go on. In the end, we looked at 45 of these different questions for which we could get answers in the law in 142 countries by now. These questions can actually be divided into 6 broad categories. Because some of them have to do with accessing institutions, some of them have to do with using property, with getting a job, with providing incentives to work, with building credit, and with going to court. Now, we built up this extremely valuable data set, literally thousands and thousands of data points, and then what I like to do, because it would only be fair, is to give you a sense of, once you synthesize this data and you put it in a report, which is what we did last time in 2011, what does the data say? What can you glean from this massive reading of legislation the world over? And so let me give you just six bits or conclusions, that I think are interesting in themselves. One of them, of course, is that gender inequality is widely prevalent all over the world. Of the countries that we covered, 142, only 38 have equal rights in all 45 indicators that we look at. In other words, there is full gender parity in the law in the areas that we have identified. That's 38 of 142. In 29 countries, in fact, there are at least 10, sometimes more differentiations. That is, ways in which the law, actively discriminates against women in one of these 45 areas. Now, of course, I want to emphasize something here. If you go back to those 38 countries in which the law makes no distinction between men and women in these 45 areas, that doesn't mean that obviously there is no gender gap. Of course there is. This is simply a reading of the law, but of course the reality on the ground is very often quite different. And so let there be no misunderstanding. Even in places like Spain, which in fact is among the 38 countries, when you look at issues of political empowerment, you look at issues of economic opportunity, economic participation, women are well behind. I'm going to come back in a few minutes to the issue of, for instance, women's participation in corporate boards, where Europe and the United States and many other countries are well behind what one would consider to be some measure of gender equality. So that's number one. Second interesting insight is that when you look at labor force participation by women, you have roughly half of the 50% of the population in the world are women. Only about 41% of the formal economy is actually, do you actually have women in the workforce. And what we discover is that in those countries that have greater legal disparities, a larger number of legal differentiations or discriminations against women, as we capture by these 45 indicators, in those countries, of course, you also have lower levels of labor force participation by women. You have lower levels of entrepreneurship, and of course, you have higher levels of poverty among women as well. So this is not surprising, but the data confirms this. When you embed in the law, active discrimination against women, this obviously has a real economy counterpart, which is reflected in much lower level of participation in the labor force and higher levels of poverty. The data shows a lot of very interesting regional differentiations. When you look at the results on a geographic basis, what you discover is that, for instance, the countries that have the largest number of these differentiations or discriminations are obviously Middle East and North Africa. This is the Middle East and the Arab world. We cover 14 countries in the region in our report, and all of these 14 countries have at least 10, sometimes considerably more differentiations that jump at you from a reading of the law. There are 3 regions that have no differentiations. One is the OECD, and rich industrial countries, doesn't surprise. The other is Latin America and Central and Eastern Europe. Right? Sorry, I want to take this back. I said it slightly inaccurately. Of the 24 countries that have at least 10 or more differentiations, none of them is in the OECD, Latin America, or Central and Eastern Europe. This is not to say that there are, for instance, no countries in Latin America that don't have some. In fact, some of them have quite a number, but less than 10. Couple of other, two or three other things. Some people think that essentially gender equality is very much linked to prosperity and rising incomes. Some people will say, look, you don't need to do very much on the legal side, or don't need to be very exercised about the fact that there are so many legal discriminations embedded in the law, because eventually as countries become richer, they will attain levels of gender equality. And the data doesn't support at all this assertion. We have among the 142 countries, we have 39 high-income countries. And among these 39 countries, you have at least 17 that have one or more of these legal discriminations. So just becoming rich is not necessarily the quickest and the best and most efficient way to address issues of gender discrimination. You have countries, especially in the Middle East, countries like Kuwait, like Qatar, like Bahrain, some of the countries in the Gulf region, for instance, that are very rich by now because of natural resources, and yet when you actually look at the law, they actively discriminate against women in a large number of ways. Interestingly, the data shows that there is a loss of property rights through marriage. A number of the indicators that we have capture aspects of property rights, and what we discovered is that when you compare men with single women, there's kind of broad equality all over the world, but when you compare men with married women, there is a huge loss of property rights through marriage. The data seems to be saying essentially that marrying is a bad business for women in many parts of the world, which is, I guess, interesting, surprising. I was telling Randy that, the Doing Business project has had huge impact in the world in the last 10 years. We just issued our 10th anniversary report a few months ago, and as the data has been compiled, as the data has been made public on an annual basis, this has generated huge spur for reforms in the area of business regulation. Especially the fact that we rank countries has provided very powerful incentives to focus the attention on governments on doing reforms. Women, Business and the Law is of course a much younger report, and it hasn't yet had the impact of doing business, but it is beginning to have that impact, and we already are beginning to track in the data very, very encouraging moves. Countries are coming to the World Bank and are saying, please include us in the report. Doing business this year is going to have 189 countries. Women, Business and the Law has 142. So there is a gap of nearly 50 countries that we're not covering. And so some of these are coming to us and saying, we'd like to be in because we think that the data is very valuable, number one. Number two, some countries are beginning to say, hey, we didn't know. Some of these things are in the books, and of course they have a counterpart in real life, but your typical minister is not aware. How many ministers have read the Constitution or the Civil Code or other legal instruments? So an example of what's happening is that a few months ago we received the visit of a deputy minister of social affairs from the Ukraine, who came to report to us quite happily that as of January 1st, 2013. Two of these differentiations identified in the data had actually been removed. They weren't generally aware of these things, but once the report came out and they noticed them, they got together, they began to discuss these issues in Parliament, and Parliament amended the laws, to eliminate these things. You might say, well, nice, encouraging. Does that actually change the reality of women on the ground? Maybe not so quickly, but it is important. It is important. You don't want the law to actually give credibility to these differentiations. So that's encouraging. And then other donors are beginning to use the data to basically put pressure on governments to amend the law. The Millennium Challenge Corporation uses our indicators to basically tell countries, fine, we'll give you the next tranche, but please, what's the point of having these discriminations in your law against women? You want to get the next tranche? Let's do something about these things, which I think is a very nice way of sort of conditionality. I'm not looking if I have messages, I'm just looking at the time because I don't have my wristwatch today, and so I want to make sure that we have, all right. We seem to be doing fine time-wise. Let me go on to the last part of my presentation, where I want to share with you just some general thoughts about some aspects that are of some concern to us at the bank, certainly concern to me and the Women, Business and the Law team. I want to talk a little bit about Egypt. I want to talk a little bit about quotas for corporate boards. I want to say something about women's education, political empowerment, and if I have time, I want to say something about property and credit. And the implications of legal differentiations in these areas for women's economic empowerment. On Egypt, I don't know whether you've been following the debate, in the last couple of years on the Arab Spring. When these processes began a couple of years ago, if you will remember, certainly if you were reading the Western media, there was a cautious air of optimism about some of these transformations. In Tunisia and Egypt and some of the other countries in the region, there was a sense that these countries were coming out of decades of authoritarian forms of governance, and that perhaps through the so-called Arab Spring, there will be an opportunity to move these countries to the 21st century, have representative forms of governance, greater transparency, to empower civil society, and so on and so forth. I don't want to pass judgment on what is likely to be the outcome of these efforts over the medium term. I do want to say what is actually happening on the gender front, and with particular reference to Egypt. You know that in 2007, the constitution in Egypt was amended, and they introduced an Article 40, which actually says the following. It says, all citizens are equal before the law, and they have equal rights and duties without distinction based on sex, origin, language, religion, or creed. And at that time, this was seen as a major improvement. It was officially embedding in the Constitution, the notion of equality of sexes before the law. There was a provisional constitution adopted in 2011 after the Arab Spring, and they took out this clause and this language on equal rights on the basis of sex. Then, as you know, they established a Constitutional Assembly that drafted the 2012 Constitution. This is where people who are following gender issues began to get a little bit concerned about the likely outcome of this exercise. But to begin with, this Constitutional Assembly, which had 100 people working on it, had only seven women. So there wasn't, people felt that there wasn't a kind of a powerful enough voice to protect the rights and the interests of women as the new Constitution was being drafted. And then, of course, after the first session of Parliament, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the participation of women in Parliament fell precipitously from 13% to 2%, which is what the percentage is now today in the Egyptian Parliament. 2% participation by women. And then in the Constitution itself, which was finally approved and passed, there is a clause that says the following. It says, the state shall enable the reconciliation between the duties of a woman toward her family and her work. In other words, the idea is essentially, if you're a woman, you automatically are facing this kind of dilemma, this dichotomy. You have responsibilities for your family, and then you have your legitimate work aspirations, right? And how you resolve these things is not something that is going to be left to you as an individual. The state will actually tell you how to resolve these things. And this is very, very, very worried, And then if you add to this, things like the criminal code, which has a clause that says that, if a husband beats her wife with good intentions, it's all right. It's not a criminal offense, All these things have led to sort of a sense of, a great deal of pessimism among women who have been on the forefront of fighting for gender equality in Egypt. It seems to me it would be incredibly ironic and tragic if, one outcome of the Arab Spring was going to be basically Egypt going back to the 19th century in terms of gender equality issues. That seems to be in the works. That seems to be happening. It's regrettable. On Norway, it's a very fascinating debate on this issue of quotas in corporate boards. There is an interesting story here in Norway, just to cut a long story into 2 minutes. In Norway, with the strong support of the Prime Minister, in February of 2002, they established some voluntary quotas for women's participation in corporate boards. They established a target of 40% by July of 2005, at a time when women's participation in corporate boards in Norway, which is a country on the cutting edge of gender empowerment, was 6%. 6% of women, 6% of corporate boards were made up of women. By July of 2005, they had reached a target, something like 25%, well short of the target. And this is when, in fact, the government began to get serious and say, okay, enough is enough. This is not going to be voluntary. And they amended the Public Companies Act. And they made the quotas mandatory, and they established a new target date, which was January of 2008. And they imposed, some very strict requirements. If quotas were not achieved by the deadline, publicly traded firms were going to be subject to fines. Then there was going to be delisting from the Oslo Stock Exchange, and then finally, if they persisted, dissolution of the company. So as you can imagine, this really got the companies energized, and they have made huge projects since then. What is more important is that other countries in Europe began to follow the Norwegian example, and then within a few years you had Italy, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Iceland introducing exactly the same kind of requirements, amending their companies' laws, so as to make this compulsory. Then other countries have begun to do this as well. In Malaysia, which is very interesting, in 2011 they established a target of 30% as well. And last year, the United Arab Emirates, without establishing an actual target, they said that they approved some kind of resolution saying that it is important to include women in corporate boards, at least accepting the possibility that this is something that is desirable. Australia and United Kingdom have moved in that direction as well. And currently, there is a law before the European Parliament that would actually establish a 40% target by 2020. And if it is adopted, and the sense is that it will be adopted, because by now so many other countries in Europe are actually doing this, if it is adopted, then it will mean that something like 5,000 publicly traded companies in the European Union, are going to have to comply with this. We can talk a little bit more during the Q&A about the desirability of quotas. I know that here in America, it's a very controversial subject. We certainly don't have quotas in the US. I myself am a supporter of it, and I can explain why. But you can challenge me, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, and I'll be happy to have a debate with you on this. Just a few more words on political empowerment and education. We have made some progress in terms of the variable that we look at typically when it comes to political empowerment, which is the participation of women in parliaments, just the share of women in parliaments. The Nordics, of course, have been leading the way for many, many years. Their participation has gone up from 39% in 2000 to something like 42% last year. But even at the global level, we have seen some progress, for something like 14% in 2000 to about 20% today. So this is good, and of course, there is a great deal of regional diversity. You have regions where it is higher, other regions where it is very low. It's particularly low, say, in the Arab world, in the Pacific, and so on. People have also begun to look at the participation of women in cabinets, and there is some really interesting empirical work that is being done with these ratios. In the early 90s, the only countries that really had something called parity in women's participation in cabinets were Finland, Norway, and Sweden. This very privileged set has expanded a little bit into other parts of the world, sometimes temporarily. In Chile, for instance, when Michelle Bachelet was the president, they had it. Once she left, they didn't. In Spain, Zapatero had this as an explicit target, and at least during the time that he was prime minister, they had equality. I'm not sure about the data now. I would guess just by looking at the photos that I remember seeing of the Madrid, with the Spanish cabinet, I think it has come down. But at least, countries like Chile, like Spain, like Switzerland, and South Africa, have moved in the direction of Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Now, why is this desirable? I can think of at least a couple of things. One is just the issue of fairness. And here I'll bring a kind of a personal anecdote. One of the jobs I had in the 1990s was I was the IMF representative in Russia between 92 and 96 approximately. And I found myself very often on one side of the table arguing with senior Russian officials about how they were going to implement their various economic policies. This was managing the transition from the craziness of Soviet central planning, to something perhaps a little better called the market economy. And very often this involved, very tough choices in terms of how you allocate resources, issues of priorities, and so on. And I don't mind telling you, on the other side of the table, we always had 100% men, certainly at the senior level, ministers and so on. It was always men. And their priorities are totally different. I mean, you pleaded with them, well, why don't you introduce some kind of system of unemployment compensation, because we're going through very tough times. No interest whatsoever. But when we wanted to tackle some of the tax breaks that Gazprom was getting, fierce resistance, fierce resistance. Why? Well, because the prime minister was a major shareholder of Gazprom, right? And so he wanted the company to be protected. I had no doubt then, I certainly don't have any doubt now, that if on the other side of the table we had a whole bunch of ladies, the debate would have shifted. Issues of social protection, issues of pensions, issues of education and expenditure on education would have figured far more prominently. And so there is this question of fairness, but also, there is empirical evidence that is being done in the academic world. If there is a paper, for instance, by two guys by the name of Crook and O'Brien, which says that as the share of women, or has shown that as the share of women in cabinet rises, a couple of interesting things happen. One of them is that the demand for female nominees and their placement in other non-cabinet positions of influence rises as well. it is as though, as the women come into the cabinet, then they basically bring in other women into senior positions in the government in their coattails. And I think this is nice. So there is an impact on the demand, but there is also an impact in the supply, that as women increase their participation in cabinets, there is also a supply effect, that women actually want to be part of government, want to serve in public office, which I think is a nice thing. Well, you haven't yet called me to shut up, so I will say one.
Half an hour.
All right. Yeah, but I want us to also have Q&A. So let me say a couple of things about girls' education. You know that we have 796 illiterate adults in the world, of which 2/3, roughly, 530 are women. And then India actually leads the way in this particular area. They account for about half of the illiterates all over the world. The figures, at least as put together by my team, and I'm sure that they've done their work correctly, we have 430 million illiterates in India, and of these, 275 million are women. Now, this in itself, without reference to any other statistics, which I will give you in a minute, but in itself, this is really a very, very tragic, very, very sort of overwhelming figure, because it basically says, there are nearly 300 million women in India that don't have access to the basics of the 21st century, which is access to knowledge and information, the ability to read a paper, the ability to basically, judge your politicians on the basis of their positions. Amartya Sen basically says that one of the reasons we want education is because it allows people not to be misled by demagogues, which we see in so many different parts of the world. People who can't read, who can't write, who don't have access to the media, are in a much weaker position to basically examine in a critical way, the validity and made by, very often very irresponsible politicians. So it's an issue that is very much linked to political empowerment as well, being able to read and write and have access to information. Now, India for me is a fascinating case because I'm a macroeconomist. I work in the IMF for many years, and so I look at budgets and I look at expenditure priorities. And India is a country that on an annual basis spends $50 billion per year, which is 4% of gross national product, subsidizing gasoline for the middle class. Have you guys been to New Delhi any time in the last few years? No. I have been to Delhi for many, many times. When I was the chief economist at the World Economic Forum, we used to have an event in India every year, and so I was always there. And I mean, India has got these incredible traffic jams, and just getting from one end of the city to the other. Well, no, I shouldn't say from one end of the city to the other. From one place in the city, just 20 blocks, further down the road, it takes an hour. And some of this is directly the result of cheap gasoline. The government basically feels that it is citizens' birthright, to have access to cheap gasoline. And this is, this is wrong on so many fronts. First of all, it is deeply regressive because who has cars in India? It's not the 300 million illiterate women. It's the middle class. They are the ones who get the break. So it's deeply regressive, number one. Number two, the IMF has actually done some calculations that basically tell you what would be the impact on global warming gases emissions if the prices of gasoline in India actually move to international levels. I mean, it is measurable. It actually may have an impact because you have, literally dozens and dozens of millions of cars spewing out, fumes because gasoline is so cheap. Because I am an economist and I have an obsession with quantification, we've actually done some calculations, and you can actually begin to ask yourself, okay, well, $50 million, how much literacy can I get for $50 billion, worth of resources? And it turns out that you get something like $182 per year per person. And you ask your question, could $182 per person in India be enough to actually, take a woman from illiteracy to literacy? Yes, of course it would be. It would be plenty of money. In fact, the situation is actually even worse because this is just India, right? So India is $50 billion. But if you look at the world as a whole, in other words, if you come up with a figure for subsidization of gasoline, across the entire planet, the figure is closer to $800 billion. And then if you compare $800 billion with the number of illiterates that we have in the world, it turns out you have something like $1,500 per person per year that we could use if you eliminated the subsidies to actually educate and bring these people from illiteracy to literacy, right? So we think that illiteracy and lack of education is actually a resource problem. That is a complete lie. It has nothing to do with resources. We have the resources. Just subsidies for 1 year would actually allow us, to wipe out illiteracy in the whole world. So it is a public policy choice that we make to keep 800 million people illiterate, right? This is what governments decide, and this is what we as citizens actually decide to support through the ballot box, right? So just wanted to mention that. And of course, I'm not going to say much about what we know from the empirical literature accumulated over the last 20, 30 years about the impact of educating women and girls, in terms of development. Not only do we have better informed political choices, which I mentioned before, but we of course have higher probability that the daughters of educated women will themselves be educated. That is clear. It makes sense, but it has been confirmed by the empirical data. Fertility rates come down. Children are healthier. Women have greater say on how to use resources within the household, and on and on and on. I mean, there are some economists, and I am certainly one of them, who actually feel that there is no other measure that has greater impact in terms of development, than to educate girls. This sounds a little bit like a religious statement, but it's actually amply confirmed by the data. And then to conclude, just a couple of very interesting insights that come from the work that is done by the team managed by Sarah, who is the program manager for Women, Business and the Law, which I think are really quite interesting. One has to do with basically property rights. In countries where the data shows that there is this legal gender gap as measured by our sort of property indicators, what we have discovered is that in these countries as well, women borrow less than in countries where there is legal parity in this area. And this is not surprising. You would expect that if they are constrained in terms of their property rights, then obviously they will have less possibility of using property as collateral to access to the credit system, which is the primary way in the developing world in which you can gain credit, is you have assets that can be used as collateral. So that, again, discrimination has a real economic counterpart in terms of what it means for women's prosperity. And then the other issue has to do with building credit. We have a number of indicators which look at, for instance, the minimum thresholds that apply to credit bureaus and registries when they collect information. And what we've discovered is that very often this threshold is very high, and it doesn't capture microfinance institutions and microfinance lending. And because of this, then these credit bureaus and registries are not able to provide valuable information about women's credit worthiness. And this is a bit regrettable, because if they can't deliver this information, then basically they don't have access to the credit system, because there is nothing to give them a sense of their credit worthiness. So I think I will stop here. As you can see, this is a very, very fascinating project. I think that I have no doubt, and I'm here making this is more a statement of belief, I have no doubt that over time, as we continue to collect the data on a regular basis, women, business, and the law will be in the area of gender what doing business at the World Bank has been over the past decade in the area of business regulation and private sector development. And so we're really quite encouraged and very hopeful about the prospects for this project. Randy.
Thank you very much. I agree. It's fascinating, and we thank you for your work, and we thank you for the amazing insights that you have shared with us today. And with that, I will open this up for questions. Can you please identify yourself before asking your question?
Hi, my name is Cheryl Yannick, and I'm a librarian at Catalyst. And I want to say thank you so much for this report because we've really found it extremely useful for our research lately, giving it to some of our members. Right now, I'm working on a piece looking at women in the workplace in Mexico, and it seems like there's so many different barriers for women's advancement, all in the workplace in all these different countries. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you might find to be some of the bigger barriers, because I know more about sort of in corporate America, what in Western Europe, what the real barriers are, but in some of the developing countries, what would you say some of the bigger barriers are? Is it the strict gender roles, or is it the educational system, or would it be these laws that are embedded in the political system? Thanks.
Or culture.
I think that there are many issues that are working to basically retard and slow down the incorporation of women into economic activity, the labor force, and so on. I think that the Women, Business, and the Law indicators highlight some of these areas. I think that, for instance, the whole question of property rights is very important. I think that there are issues of resource allocation and priorities. The example that I gave you of India is one, but I could give you many more, where you basically have budgetary decisions being made in countries, where there isn't enough of a women's voice in the prioritization of resources. I was in a meeting in Colombia in December of about a year ago, and I made a statement which I'll share it with you for all it's worth, but I was talking about the importance of higher education, and the importance of investing in higher education. And actually the data that comes from Latin America, this was a meeting organized by the World Bank, for the Latin American region. The data that comes out for Latin America is actually not very encouraging, You have countries like Sweden and Finland that spend 7% of GNP on education and have, some of the best qualified labor forces in the world. And there are the indicators that measure this, and I can share this with you what these indicators are, but just take my word for it. Some of the best qualified labor forces in the world are not in the United States and Japan. They're actually in Finland and Sweden and in Norway and some of these countries because they spend heavily on education. But you look at the data for Latin America, it's pitiful. The levels are low by and large, with a few exceptions. If you look at, say, the ranking of universities, pick any ranking. There are a number of exercises that are being done in different parts of the world, and you take a list of, let's say, the top 200 universities in the world. There is not a single university from Latin America among those. And what I said at this meeting was that, however, when it comes to football, I mean, people take this seriously. We are in the top leagues, and so, we think of nothing of spending billions organizing World Cup championships and so on and so forth. Now, this is not to suggest that sport is not important. This is not to suggest that physical fitness is not important. Of course it is, but it's an issue of priorities. It's an issue of emphasis. It's an issue of, where do you get the most impact, for a given level, for a given amount of resources in an environment that is constrained in terms of resources. And so I think that this is certainly one dimension to your question, that in deciding on priorities for expenditure, very often, and I think this is mainly because these decisions are made by men. We often don't think about development impact. We think about prestige. We think about a number of other things, that are not relevant. I gave you the example of tax breaks for Gazprom in Russia, but I could give you many more. You mentioned culture. I think that is important. That is important. There is a strand of thought in many parts of the developing world, especially in some of these countries that have many of these discriminations against women, that you talk to them about them and they say, wait a minute, don't try to impose your values on my country. This is the way we like to run things here, right? And you, with your Western, sort of free market philosophy, essentially are trying to impose your culture on us. The extreme example of this is, of course, the Taliban in the 1990s, because that's exactly what they said. The Taliban in the 1990s went around the world when they were under withering criticism for the international community for not educating girls. They would go about and in various fora they would say, look guys, these are our values, you have to respect them. This is the way we like to run things here, right? Of course, what they didn't say is that in Afghanistan in the 1990s, nobody ever bothered to ask the 11 million women in the country whether they actually wanted to live in a system in which girls were not educated. If this had been left up to a vote, I can assure you that, the vote would have gained more than 50%, because women on the whole would have said, yes, we're happy for this, and then there would have been a share, perhaps small in Afghanistan under the Taliban, a share of men who would have said, yes, of course, this cannot obviously be harmful. And so to say that, we're going to make a cultural exception, well, I say cultural exceptions are fine, provided that there is openness in society and people are actually willing, are willing and able to vote, to actually decide what the cultural exception is going to be. And in any case, I think we're past that debate by now. So there are these, all these issues which I think have a bearing on your question.
Next question, Liza.
Good morning, I'm Liza Gross from OmniLife. My question has to do with the way in which the private sector has connected or not connected with this research and with the evolution of the law. And moving forward, what kind of suggestions would you have for ways in which the private sector can engage productively to support the research and the change?
I think that in the private sector, there is growing recognition of the importance of gender equality and having greater participation on the part of women in economic decision making. In one of my previous jobs, I was in Geneva at the World Economic Forum. I was running the competitiveness program there, and I was the chief economist as well. And we did the first gender gap report at the forum in my department. And one of the things that we noticed was that those countries that had made the greatest progress in reducing the gender gap in a number of areas, political empowerment, participation, and so on, health, education, were also the most competitive economies in the world. And this was kind of a surprise. I mean, when you plot it, the sort of the gender gap rankings with the competitiveness rankings, it was very, very clear correlation. And this was interesting because the competitiveness rankings and the data had nothing on gender, right? So there was not kind of some spurious correlation going on. It was actually there. And when you think about it, it makes eminent sense, really. I mean, when you sort of look at it from an economic perspective, because, competitiveness eventually has to do with, effective utilization of resources, including human resources. And when, because of culture, because of religion, because of lack of education, because of some taboos and so on, a country is holding back its women, is not utilizing the resources fully, well, of course productivity is going to be undermined. It's not a surprise. It makes eminent sense if you hold your women down, if you don't educate them, or if you educate them and then you can't let them get a job. If you put all kinds of burdens on them because of these factors, including misunderstanding of religion, culture, whatever, then obviously, you're going to operating at a suboptimal level. You're not going to be able to tap into the full reservoir of talents and skills that is embedded in your population, right? If you're just tapping into the male part of it. So that's not surprising. That's not surprising. Furthermore, as you know, there is increasing data that for instance, there is a study that has looked at Fortune 500 companies and has, picked up those companies that have the highest participation of women in corporate boards and have discovered that they are better run, they're more profitable, et cetera, right? Now, what's really, depending on how you look at it, you could say that it is discouraging. I would say no, it's not so much discouraging. Maybe it's just fascinating in a kind of a perverse way, right? What is really fascinating is that when you go back to Norway, right? So this is Norway, right? This is a country, you know, on the cutting edge of these issues, right? Norway is a country. I love Norway. In general, I love the Nordic countries, but you know, Norway is a country that had an oil minister who was a woman, you know, back many years ago. And she used to go to these meetings of the OPEC. And one of these meetings, you know, she happened to be taking place in Riyadh or one of these, you know, Gulf countries. And she happened to be breastfeeding. And so there was this picture of, you know, all these sheiks, you know, sitting around the table very much like this one, and this woman basically breastfeeding her child in front of all these sheiks, deliberately, you know, trying to cause a scandal, right? So that's Norway, right? And she was sending a very powerful message. I am the minister, I sit with a voice here, but I also happen to have a child, and I'm breastfeeding, right? Now, but when the quota was introduced in 2002, I mean, there was an enormous amount of pushback from the bosses, right? They said, no, where are we going to find these women, right? You know, the argument that they used is, you know, you're going to force on us, you know, inefficiencies because we don't have adequately trained women to take on these positions of responsibility. And then I remember sharing a table like this with a lady in, this was a meeting in the UK, but the lady co-speaker was a person that in Oslo had created a training institute to actually train women to assume the role, you know, so that they could sit on boards. Because true enough, since they had not been part of the boards, you know, what the corporate bosses were saying was spuriously true, i.e., you know, we don't have enough women qualified. What Exposed turned out to be very interesting is that providing them with the kind of training that was necessary to sit on corporate boards actually was an easy task, And what was also interesting is that some of the women that were tapped to be members of corporate boards were rock singers and entertainers and, you know, smart ladies, you know, who just hadn't sort of done their work in the business world, but who, with a crash course of a few months, could actually, you know, pick up you know, the necessary skills, thereby showing that what the bosses were saying about skills and capacity and so on, you know, it helps not to be an idiot, right, to sit on a corporate board, but you know, you don't need a PhD, and these women were able to bridge that education gap or capacity gap within a few months with a crash course. And so,
because here what we are hearing is women saying that unless the woman has reached a certain position in their corporation or run a department, they are incapable of going to a board. So you're saying that you can take a crash course, you could take a bunch of us and give us a crash course, and we too can become board members.
I think so. I mean, I ask you, you know, think about some of the companies that crashed in this city, right, in 2007 and 2008 in the context of the global financial crisis. I mean, these companies were run by men, right? Would the outcome have been worse if you had had lots of women on the boards? I hardly think so. I think the outcome might have been even better because you wouldn't have had all these men taking all these, you know, incredible risks, you know, with other people's money, right? So.
Right there.
Sandy Hecker, do you have empirical data on those women, those countries where women have greater access to mobiles and internet, where even if you have less formal education where they can educate themselves, is there greater gender equality? And also that would give them, with mobile technology, greater credit, you know, like they do in Africa, greater, where they use the mobile for their own personal banking system. Do you have any data in regards to this?
I'm going to ask Sarah to comment on this because she's running the program and she knows exactly what is the latest data that we're collecting on women, business, and the law. Sarah, please.
Thank you for the question, Sandy. So we don't collect that data, but I do know another part of the World Bank Group does, and I'm happy to direct you to them. We can speak afterwards.
Hi, I'm sorry. Alejandra Cadena. Actually, I just one kind of like answer part of your questions. I'm not an expert, obviously, but I think in terms of your question about Mexico, I am from Mexico, and I think part of the problem there, again, this is just my own personal theory, is more cultural than anything, because the government actually in Mexico, they spend more money. I mean, it's kind of funny that you say they spend a lot of money in soccer games and everything, but that's not true. In Mexico, actually, I spend a lot of money on education. Where it goes, there's a different story, you know. Sorry? Well, actually, and that was another example that I was going to put, that is more about culture, because in Switzerland, and woman participation in the workforce is very, very low. So even though it's an advanced country, it's still, they don't have equal opportunities in Switzerland. And it is cultural. I think Switzerland is also a very men, macho type society. And that is the case in Mexico. That's my opinion.
Yeah, what you say about Switzerland is actually quite correct. I remember that the first time that the World Economic Forum's gender gap report came out, you know, it created huge headlines in Switzerland, in the domestic press, because Switzerland did not do well at all. You know, and this was actually picked up because of labor force participation, levels of education, and so on. And of course, you know that Switzerland is a country that gave women the vote very late in sort of the timeline, which began sometime in the late 19th century with New Zealand and you know, moved on. I remember, I think in Switzerland, they were given the vote at the, which came first, Sarah, the federal or the local?
I think the local started first, and then the federal happened, and then afterwards, the last state in Switzerland was in the late 70s to give the vote, and that was by the Constitutional Court had to order it.
Right.
Actually, it was Appenzeller in 1987, the last canton that gave the right to vote to women, 1987.
Yeah. I mean, a country that gives women to the vote in the 1960s, you know, is really quite shocking. I remember, this is just purely anecdote, but I'll share it with you because I think it says something about Switzerland in this area of gender. The night before we released the report, the World Economic Forum's report on gender, which I think was in 2004, I was at the dinner in Geneva at the home of a banker friend, and he had invited this lady, who was a prominent banker in it's either UBS or Credit Suisse, I can't remember, you know, one of the top two Swiss banks. And she said that you know, she'd been with the bank for a long time. She'd made her career there, but she said that for a very, very long time in these two banks, you know, as late as whatever the 1980s, to be a department director, you needed to be a Swiss Army colonel as well. You know, I mean, it was just a requirement. You know, this was this all boys club. And, you know, Switzerland has this sort of civilian volunteer army. It's a little bit like Israel. You know, everybody serves, and so if you didn't fulfill this additional requirement beyond your competency, you know, within the bank of being a Swiss Army colonel, you just didn't make it. And so she was basically unable to get to that position for a long time, even though she obviously, you know, had incredible gifts and capacities. And, you know, this changed eventually, and then, you know, she made it, you know, near the top, but not without, you know, some struggles. So.
We have time for another question. Perfectly clear. Are there any comments that you'd like to make in general about Latin America? Which is the worst country? Which is the best country?
You know that I am a great admirer of what the Chileans have done in terms of economic development over the last, 20, 30 years. You know, Chile is the country that has been the most successful in reducing poverty. Is the country that has the most impressive physical infrastructure. It's a country that has incredibly efficient macro management. You know, these days we talk a lot about debt, right? We talk about high levels of public debt in Europe and in Spain and Italy, in the United States, in Japan, and everywhere. You know, debt. Chile has virtually no debt. It has, I think, 10% of GDP. You know? So. Chile is a country that when it had an earthquake in early 2011, if I remember correctly, you know, was able to reconstruct the country within 18 months, you know, without you know, going into debt, without, you know, purely tapping into some savings that substantial savings that they have accumulated over the years. So it's really a country that does extremely well on the doing business indicators, does extremely well on the competitiveness indicators put out with the World Economic Forum. It is already operating at levels of efficiency that are well above the European Union average. And yet, when it comes to gender, it is among the worst in Latin America. And this is such a puzzle that we're going to do a case study actually on the next Women, Business and the Law report on Chile, because there's a country that has a substantial number of differentiations. I actually lived in Chile for many years. My first job coming out of graduate school was teaching at the university there. And you could see this. You could see this in a number of different ways. You know, women were held back. There was a lot of prejudice, you know, all kinds of embedded suppositions and prejudices. And so, to me, this is a kind of an interesting riddle. Of course, it has changed, and it has moved in the right direction, and we did have Michelle Bachelet as head of state, and I'm told that, you know, during the next election, the job is for her to take back if she wants it. I mean, she left with such high levels of popularity that if she wanted to get back and be the next head of state, you know, they will roll out the carpet and she will win with you know, hands down. No politician will enter into a self-destructive path of wanting to challenge her, right? So there you go. I mean, there has been progress made, but still, you know, when it comes to the indicators picked up by Sarah's team, you know, it is among the worst in Latin America. And I've been thinking a lot about this in recent weeks, you know, ahead of the publication of this case study in the next report. So.
And the best? Is there a best?
Costa Rica, I know does very well. Do you remember off the top of your head, Sarah, other countries that do well in?
And in general, I would say that we see a similar trend in Latin America. So we just did a time series data set, which will also be published in the fall, looking at how countries have reformed over the past 50 years. So 100 countries in some of our indicators. And what we found is in Latin America over the past 20, 30 years, there were several countries that did as poorly as Chile, but they've reformed. They've reformed in many ways, and it really sort of tracks the reforms that happened in Spain in the 70s. And then you see similar reforms in Argentina and Brazil. But Augusto's right, Costa Rica does very well. There are several other countries that do well, but we don't rank, fortunately or unfortunately, in the same way as doing business, so we don't have a top, but we can tell you what the worst performers are in.
Maybe that's something that you can do, that they can start competing with one another to improve. Well, thank you very much. You have turned something that could have been very dry into something very live, and we want to hear more. So we invite you to come back in the fall when you have the next version, or if you want to travel with us. This is part of our gender series. Susan is passionate about gender. We had a big conference or networking session in October. We're going to have one in October, and we're going to run some sessions, workshops in Buenos Aires, in Sao Paulo, in Mexico, and in Bogota. So if you'd like to come with us, we invite you. Thank you very much.